The morning Marcus Quinn rode into Dustfall, Nevada. The sun was cutting hard and bright across the flats like a blade drawn from a forge, and every man on the main street who saw him come in knew without needing to be told that this was not a man who stayed anywhere for long. He was 31 years old, lean through the chest and wide through the shoulders, with dark hair that had grown past his collar and a jaw that carried several days of dark stubble. His coat was the color of tobacco, worn at the elbows but still holding its shape, and his boots, those boots, had silver spurs attached to the heels that jangled with every step his roan horse took. Small, deliberate sounds. The kind of sound that announced a man before his face ever came into view. People in 4 territories had heard those spurs before they had ever seen Marcus Quinn, and somehow that seemed to suit him just fine. He had not removed those spurs in 3 years. It was not a boast. It was not something he advertised in saloons or mentioned to the strangers he drank beside. It was simply a fact that had settled into his life, the way silt settles into a riverbed quietly, incrementally, until it becomes the shape of the bottom itself. 3 years ago, in a town called Red Rock Crossing in southern Utah, he had made a decision that had cost him everything that had ever made him feel like a man worth knowing. He had stopped being that man. And the spurs that his father had buckled onto his boots with careful, prideful hands the day Marcus had turned 17 had stayed on, day after day, as a kind of penance. A reminder: you do not get to rest. You do not get to sit easy. You do not deserve the comfort of stillness. So he rode, he worked. He hired himself out as a trail guide, a cattle drover, an occasional deputy when a town got desperate enough to overlook his reputation, and he kept moving because moving was the only thing that worked. He did not make friends. He did not linger over meals. He did not accept invitations, and he did not extend them. Dustfall, Nevada, in the autumn of 1878, was not the kind of town that appeared on maps printed east of the Mississippi. It was a wide street, low sky kind of settlement, grown up fast around a silver mining operation that had boomed 3 years back and was now beginning slowly, quietly, with the creeping certainty of a tide going out to decline. The men who had stayed were the stubborn ones, the ones without anywhere better to go, or the ones who had put down some kind of root, even in the hard, alkaline soil of the Nevada desert. Marcus had come through Dustfall twice before in his wandering years, and he had no plan to stay longer than a night or 2 this time either. He needed to sell the pair of horses he had driven up from a ranch in California, collect his pay from the man at the livery stable who had commissioned them, and move on north before the first real cold came down from the mountains. He stabled his roan, collected his money from old Bert Calloway at the livery, a wiry, sun-browned man of 60, with the handshake of someone who had been squeezing rope his entire life, and then stood for a moment in the middle of the main street, looking at the town around him. The Grand Hotel was still standing, he noticed, though its sign had lost 2 letters. The barber had moved. There was a new dry goods establishment on the east side of the street with a freshly painted front that looked almost cheerful against the weathered wood around it. And there, where the old hardware store had been, stood something that had not existed the last time he passed through. It was a small restaurant. Not a saloon with food served as an afterthought. Not a boarding house kitchen that let paying guests eat at a communal table. This was a proper restaurant, or as close to one as you were likely to find in a town this size and this far from anything that could properly be called civilization. It had curtains in the window. White curtains, which was an extraordinary thing when you thought about it, because keeping anything white in a desert mining town was an act of pure stubborn will. There was a hand-painted sign above the door that read, "Ford's Table, meals served noon and evening, beef, bread, pie." Marcus stood looking at it for a moment longer than he intended to. He was hungry. He was genuinely, properly hungry in a way that trail jerky and cold biscuits had not addressed in several days. And there was something about that white curtain, bright against the dust-colored wood, that snagged his attention the way small things sometimes do when a man has been too long on the road. He crossed the street. The spurs rang against the hard-packed dirt with each step, clear and bright in the still morning air. The inside of Ford's table was modest and clean. 4 square tables with 4 chairs each, covered in oilcloth of a deep blue-green color that made the whole room feel somehow cooler than the air outside warranted. There was a small wood stove against the back wall, not yet lit at this hour, and a long wooden counter with a gap at one end that led to the kitchen behind. There were shelves along one wall with jars of preserved things, tomatoes, green beans, something amber-colored that might have been peaches, and the whole place smelled of coffee and wood smoke, and something sweet that Marcus could not immediately identify but that made his chest feel, for just one startled second, like something had reached inside and shifted a weight that had been sitting there for too long. There were 2 men already eating at a table near the window, working men from the mine by the look of them, their heads bent over their plates with the focused attention of people who understood exactly how valuable a hot meal was. They did not look up. Marcus stood just inside the door and looked around for someone to tell him where to sit, because he had been in enough establishments to know that a woman who ran a place like this usually had opinions about where people put themselves. She came out from behind the counter a moment later, carrying a coffee pot in one hand and a clean cloth draped over her opposite forearm, and Marcus Quinn, who had not been surprised by anything in longer than he could honestly remember, felt something in him go unexpectedly still. Celia Ford was 26 years old, though she would not have told you that if you asked her directly, not because she was vain about it, but because she did not see that it was anyone's particular business. She was of medium height with dark auburn hair pinned up at the back of her head, in the practical manner of a woman who had too much to do to spend time on arrangements, though several strands had worked loose and curved along her jaw and the side of her neck, in a way that was entirely unintentional and entirely striking. Her face was the kind of face that a man might overlook the first time he saw it, and then find himself unable to stop thinking about. Not the immediate bright beauty of the kind that drew crowds, but the slower, surer kind that deepened the more you looked, that had intelligence in the eyes and something steady and undeceived in the set of the mouth. Her eyes were a dark, warm brown, and she looked at Marcus Quinn as he stood in her doorway with an expression that was perfectly polite and entirely unsentimental. "Good morning," she said. "Are you here for breakfast or just out of the sun?" "Breakfast," Marcus said. She looked at him for a moment, not the assessing look of someone deciding whether he was dangerous, though he recognized that particular look and was well acquainted with it, but something more straightforward, more practical, as if she were simply taking the full measure of a situation before deciding what to do about it. Then she said, quietly and without any particular ceremony, "Come sit down. There's a table here." She nodded toward the table nearest the counter, the one farthest from the 2 miners, and Marcus, for reasons he did not examine in that moment, crossed the room and sat down at it. The chair scraped the floor as he pulled it out. The spurs rang softly as he settled his feet. She set a coffee cup in front of him and filled it without asking, which was the right decision, and then said, "I have eggs and salt pork this morning, or I can do griddle cakes if you prefer. Bread is fresh. The pie won't be ready until noon." "Eggs," Marcus said. "Whatever else you have." She nodded and went back through the gap in the counter without any fuss. Marcus wrapped both hands around the coffee cup and looked at the steam rising from it. The 2 miners at the other table were talking now in low voices about something underground, the way men always talked about underground things with a kind of intimate, exhausted specificity that came from sharing a danger no one who hadn't done it would ever fully understand. The curtains moved a little in the breeze from the open door. Outside, the main street of Dustfall was beginning to fill up with its usual morning business, horses and boots, and the distant clanging sound of someone working metal somewhere. Marcus drank his coffee and breathed for a moment. When Celia Ford brought his food, She said it in front of him with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had done this 1,000 times, and found neither drudgery nor glamour in it, but simply the solid satisfaction of work done well. There were eggs, scrambled with something green in them herbs from the look of it, which was a refinement he had not expected, and salt pork, and 2 thick slices of bread with butter that was actual butter, not the rancid yellow grease that passed for it in Trailtown establishments, and a small pot of something dark and spiced that turned out, when he spread it on the bread, to be a plum preserve with a hint of something like cinnamon or clove. He ate slowly. He was not in the habit of eating slowly, because eating slowly was a luxury that required the feeling of being safe in a place, and Marcus Quinn had not felt safe in a place in longer than he cared to count. But something about this room, the oilcloth and the preserved things on the shelves and the white curtains moving in the morning air, made him slow down without deciding to. He was halfway through his second slice of bread when he noticed that the spurs were still ringing faintly every time he shifted his weight in the chair, and that the sound, which he never normally noticed because it was as continuous as breathing to him, seemed somehow out of place in the quiet of this room. He noticed it, and then he set it aside and ate the rest of his breakfast. He paid Celia Ford when she came back 30 cents, which was fair for what she had provided and the distance from any supply city, and stood up to leave, and she was already moving back toward the kitchen, and he walked out into the bright Nevada morning feeling, in some manner he could not have articulated or would have bothered to articulate even if he could, slightly less like a man who was going nowhere. He told himself he would be gone by nightfall. He was still in Dustfall 4 days later. The first day he stayed was because Bert Calloway mentioned that a rancher east of town needed someone to assess a trail route before a late-autumn cattle drive, and the money was decent, and the job was only 2 days. Marcus rode out and did the work, examining the terrain, checking the water sources, making notes in the small leather journal he carried, and came back on the evening of the second day. He went to Ford's table for supper. Celia Ford was alone in the dining room that evening, the supper hour having ended, and she was wiping down the tables with the methodical attention of a woman who believed that the last task of the day deserved the same care as the first. She looked up when Marcus came in, and something in her expression shifted in a way that was so small he might have imagined it, a slight relaxation around the eyes perhaps, or the almost imperceptible easing of a posture that had been held a little too straight. "We're past supper," she said, "but I have soup left, and the pie is real today." "Soup and pie would suit me fine," Marcus said. He sat at the same table he had sat at the first morning, the one nearest the counter. He did not think about the fact that this was already a habit of some kind. He thought about the soup, which turned out to be a bean and beef affair that was deeply and honestly good, the kind of food that took most of a day to come together and could not be hurried without loss, and the pie, which was dried apple with a crust that had been worked to exactly the right consistency of crumble and give. Celia sat down at the table across from him when she finished wiping down the other surfaces, not in a familiar way, not as if she had decided to spend the evening with him, but in the way of someone who has been on her feet since before light and has earned the right to put her feet down for a moment, and who happens to be in the same room as another person and does not feel the need to perform any particular solitude about it. "You're still here," she said. It was not an accusation or an invitation. It was simply the observation of someone who was accustomed to cataloging her world as it actually was. "Trail work," Marcus said. "East of town," she nodded. "For the Harmon Ranch." "That's the one. Old Robert Harmon has been trying to establish a fall route for 3 years, she said. He'll ask a man to survey it and then not use the information. He doesn't actually want a route. He wants someone to tell him the one he already knows about is the right one." Marcus looked at her across the table. "That's more or less what happened," he said. She allowed a brief smile that changed her whole face, not a dazzling smile, not the kind that was deployed for effect, but a real one that came from actually being amused and didn't care whether he noticed it or not. He paid you, at least. He did. There was a comfortable silence for a moment, the kind that felt earned rather than merely endured. Marcus drank his coffee and listened to the evening wind picking up outside, carrying the sound of the piano from the saloon 3 buildings down, a competent player, he noticed, better than most. "How long have you had this place?" Marcus asked. Celia turned her coffee cup between her hands. 2 years and some months, she said. "I came to Dustfall with my husband. He was a mining engineer. He died in a collapse 14 months ago." She said this with a directness that was neither emotionally suppressed nor emotionally performed. She was telling him a fact about her life that was also the central fact of her current circumstance, because she was a practical woman who understood that context mattered and that pretending otherwise was a waste of time. "I'm sorry," Marcus said, and meant it in the plain way that the words are meant when they are meant at all. "Thank you," she said. She looked out the window for a moment. The restaurant was his idea, actually. Daniel was always better at planning than I was. He had it all mapped out. We would run it together. I would manage the kitchen and the daily operations. He would do the books and the ordering. He had a good head for that sort of thing. She paused. "So I do it all now. The books are the hardest part. I was never trained for numbers." "You seem to be managing," Marcus said. "I am managing," Celia said. It was said without false modesty and without bravado, just the steady acknowledgement of a woman who had looked at the hardest facts of her life and decided to stand in them rather than around them. Marcus thought about saying more and did not. He finished his pie and thanked her for the meal and left her there in the quiet of her clean dining room, and the Spurs rang across the threshold and out into the night street. He did not leave the next day. This was because, in the morning, Bert Calloway mentioned that a man named Holt Greer had been making inquiries around town about Celia Ford's property, specifically about whether the building and the land it sat on were free and clear, and who held any outstanding debts against it. Bert mentioned it the way old men in small towns always mentioned things they thought a traveler should know before he moved on casually, between 2 other pieces of information, as if it were merely one more item in a general inventory of local conditions. Marcus stood outside the livery and turned this information over. Holt Greer was a name he knew, though not from personal dealings. Greer operated out of several Nevada towns and had a particular business model that was not illegal in any way that a territorial court had yet managed to address. He identified properties whose owners were financially vulnerable, moved in on the debt, and acquired the land and buildings at prices that were technically agreed upon but realistically coerced. He was the kind of man the law could not touch because his methods were careful, but he was also the kind of man who did not back away from pressure once he had decided he wanted something. Marcus did not tell himself he was staying because of Celia Ford. He told himself he had some time before his next commitment, and that the soup was good and the coffee was honest, and there was no particular reason to leave in a hurry. He believed perhaps a quarter of this reasoning. He spent the morning asking careful questions, the way a man who has worked as a deputy in 3 different territories learns to ask questions, as if he is not particularly interested in the answers. He learned that Celia Ford did own the building outright. Her husband had paid for it clear, but that the business was running on thin margins and that she had taken a small loan from the town's informal lending operation, which happened to be administered by a man who was, as these things so often worked out in frontier towns, a close associate of Holt Greer. The loan was not enormous. It was the kind of sum that a woman running a small restaurant on decent but not excessive income could manage, provided nothing unexpected happened. It was also the kind of sum that could be manipulated, if someone were willing to be patient about it, into a pressure that became very difficult to refuse. In the early afternoon, Marcus walked to Ford's table, which was quiet between meals, and found Celia in the kitchen doing the slow, sustained labor of bread-making, the first long knead, both arms working against the dough in a rhythm that was almost meditative. She looked up when he appeared in the kitchen doorway, not startled, just attentive. "I have a question about your finances," Marcus said. "And I want you to know before I ask it that I am not asking because I intend to make use of the answer for any purpose other than your benefit, and if you'd rather not answer, I will accept that without argument." Celia looked at him steadily for a moment, her hands still pressed into the dough. Then she said, "Ask it." He asked it. He told her what he had learned about Greer. He told her clearly and completely, without embellishment, laying it out the way he had learned to lay out bad terrain to a rancher who needed to understand it, without softening the hard parts, because softening the hard parts helped no one. Celia listened. She did not interrupt, and she did not look away, and when he finished, she was quiet for a long moment, and he could see her thinking. Not panicking, not crumbling, but doing the real, hard work of thinking through a situation that was genuinely threatening and deciding what she actually thought about it. "How long do you think I have?" she asked. "Before Greer moves openly, I'd guess 2, maybe 3 months if the loan payment holds. But if something disrupts the income, a bad season, an unexpected expense, he could accelerate." She nodded once slowly. "All right," she said. "Thank you for telling me." "I could help," Marcus said, and then was faintly surprised at himself for saying it. Celia looked at him with the particular careful attention she seemed to bring to everything. "How?" "I have some experience with men like Greer. Not always the legal kind of experience, but the kind that's sometimes more useful." She considered this for a moment with perfect seriousness. "I don't want trouble in my establishment," she said. "And I don't want anyone hurt on my account." "That's not what I'm suggesting," Marcus said. "What I'm suggesting is that men like Greer operate on calculations. They move when they think the target is a loan and the outcome is easy. Change either of those variables and the calculation changes." She studied him. "You'd stay." "For a while," Marcus said, "if you want it." There was a long pause in which the only sounds were the dough being worked, and the distant afternoon wind and Marcus Quinn's Spurs making their small, constant sound against the kitchen floor. "I'll think about it," Celia Ford said finally. "Come for supper tonight." He came for supper, and she said yes, and he went to Bert Calloway's and arranged to board his horse for an extended period, and rented a room at the Grand Hotel that had lost 2 letters from its sign, a narrow room with a window that looked out over the back alley, and a bed that was adequate if uninspiring, and began to make himself, in the way that a man can make himself useful in a small place without drawing too much attention to the fact that he is doing so, a quiet and steady presence in Dustfall. He ate at Ford's table every morning and every evening. He took to sitting with his coffee at the table near the door in the later morning hours when the place was quiet, reading the newspapers that came in by stage from Carson City 2 weeks late, which was late enough that the news had a kind of historical quality that Marcus found easier to sit with than the nervous urgency of current events. Sometimes Celia would come out from the kitchen and sit across from him for a few minutes with her own coffee, and they would talk, not always about important things, not always about the threat that was gathering at the edges of her life, but about all kinds of things. The way the desert changed color in the late afternoon. The books she had brought with her from Missouri, a whole crate of them that lived in her living quarters above the restaurant, which she apparently read with genuine pleasure and real attention. His years on the trail, which she listened to with the focused interest of someone for whom the wider world was a thing she understood intellectually, but had experienced only in fragments. He told her about the territories he had crossed, the mountains and the rivers and the particular quality of light in different places, the blue-white light of the high Utah plateaus, the thick amber light of the Texas coastal plains in summer, the shocking green of the eastern Kansas grasslands in spring when the rain had been good. He told her these things with a plain, unself-conscious precision that surprised him slightly, because he was not in the habit of describing his experience to anyone and had not thought, until he heard himself doing it, that he had accumulated the words for it. Celia listened and occasionally asked questions, and her questions were always interesting, not the polite questions of someone keeping a conversation moving, but the genuine questions of someone who wanted to know something specific that had not yet been answered. "Did you ever want to stop somewhere?" she asked him once, on a cool October morning when the light through the white curtains had a particular clean slant to it that made the whole room look like a painting from a gallery he had once walked through in San Francisco, though he would not have been able to say so without sounding foolish. Marcus was quiet for a moment. "I wanted to not need to keep moving," he said finally. "That's a different thing." She looked at him with those steady dark eyes. "What made you start?" He turned his coffee cup. Outside, the main street was getting its mid-morning business done, the distant percussion of horses and voices and the rhythmic sound of someone splitting wood somewhere nearby. "Something happened," he said, "in a town called Red Rock Crossing, 3 years ago." He stopped. He had not talked about Red Rock Crossing to anyone. He had carried it the way the Spurs carried themselves, constantly present, constantly marking time, but never examined aloud. Celia did not push. She simply sat with the silence in the comfortable, unhurried way she seemed to sit with everything. And after a moment Marcus found himself talking. 3 years ago, he had been working as a deputy in Red Rock Crossing, a small town in southern Utah that had a marshal who was getting old, and a problem with a group of men who were running a protection scheme through the local ranching community. Marcus had been young, 28, which felt younger now than it had then, and certain of things in the way that a man who has been good at surviving tends to be certain of things that require more than survival. There had been a confrontation. He had handled it badly. Not violently, there had been no shooting. No one had been physically hurt. He had handled it badly in the subtler, more corroding way of a man who had the right information and made the wrong decision about who to trust with it. And as a result, a family that should have been protected had lost its ranch, its livelihood, and eventually its ability to hold together. He had watched it happen with the terrible clarity of someone who understood exactly how much of it was attributable to his own error in judgment, and then he had ridden away, because staying had seemed like the cruelest thing he could offer them. He had not removed his Spurs the night he left. He had not removed them the next night, or the next, or any of the nights that followed, because somewhere in the hours of that first night's riding, he had arrived at the wordless decision that he did not get to take them off. That stillness was not for him. That rest was not for him. That the sound of them was a reminder, and the reminder was necessary, and the only thing he could offer as restitution to a family that could not hear it was to carry the weight of knowing without laying it down. 3 years. 4 territories, uncounted miles. Celia listened to all of it without speaking, and when he was done she was quiet for a moment, in which Marcus became aware, with a kind of slow-building discomfort, that he had said far more than he had intended to and could not now take any of it back. "That family," Celia said eventually. "Did you ever find out what happened to them?" "Last I heard, through a man who'd come through Red Rock Crossing 6 months after, they'd relocated to Nevada. Not far from here, as it happens. A place called Miners Junction." "The Walcott family," Celia said. Marcus looked at her sharply. "Henry and Louise Walcott," Celia said. "They have a small cattle operation near Miners Junction now. They come through Dustfall maybe once a season. Louise buys preserves and Henry always orders the stew." She paused, looking at him steadily. "Henry is not a bitter man, if that's what you're wondering. He talks about what happened as a hard time that made them stronger. He doesn't name names." Marcus absorbed this with the careful, deliberate attention of someone who has received information that is reorganizing a significant internal structure. He was quiet for a long time. "That doesn't make what I did right," he said finally. "No," Celia agreed. "But it means the damage you did was not irreparable. Things that aren't irreparable carry different weights than you've been giving this one." He looked at her across the table. This woman who ran a restaurant in a desert town and read books and made bread that took all morning and kept white curtains in a place where nothing stayed white, and who was looking at him with the kind of direct, compassionate honesty that he had not been offered in 3 years. And he felt something shift in his chest that was large and uncomfortable and entirely real. He did not say anything. But that night, for the first time in a long time, he slept without the jerking wakefulness that usually visited him in the small hours. And when he woke in the gray pre-dawn light of his narrow room, the first thing he was aware of was not the familiar weight of the past but the simple, immediate present. The light, the cool air, the sound of the town waking up, and the thought, just the thought, nothing more of the morning at Ford's table, and the coffee and whatever Celia Ford would be making in that kitchen when he got there. Holt Greer arrived in Dustfall on a Wednesday in late October, riding a well-appointed bay horse, and accompanied by 2 men who had the look of hired assistants, careful men, patient men, the kind who had been chosen for their ability to wait and watch and apply exactly the right pressure at exactly the right moment. Greer himself was a man of about 45, prosperous-looking in the way of men who have learned to use prosperity as a kind of threat, well-dressed for the frontier, with a neat dark beard and eyes that moved with a quick, calculating intelligence that missed very little. Marcus was sitting at his usual table at Ford's table when Greer and his men walked past on the main street, and he watched them through the window with the quiet, accurate attention of a man who knew what he was looking at. He told Celia that evening. She was clearing the supper dishes, and she paused in her work when he described Greer's appearance, and he could see her doing the same thing he did, not panicking, not despairing, but thinking clearly and rapidly through the implications. "He'll come to the restaurant," she said. "Probably within a day or 2, Marcus said. "He'll want to take a measure of you first, see how things stand. And when he comes, you serve him," Marcus said. "You're polite and you're normal and you give him nothing to use. I'll be here." She looked at him with a complicated expression that he was beginning to be able to read, the slight tension around the eyes that meant she was weighing something, the steadiness of her gaze that meant she had made peace with whatever the weight turned out to be. "You've done this kind of thing before," she said. "Yes," Marcus said. "Not always well. But sometimes well," she said. "Yes." She nodded once. "All right," she said. Greer came the next morning without his men, which was a deliberate signal. "I am only here for coffee and perhaps a conversation, nothing to be alarmed about." He was smooth and pleasant and ordered eggs and coffee, and complimented Celia on the food with the precise, expert warmth of a man who had learned to be likable in the way that other men learn to use a rifle, as a tool, with specific intentions. Marcus was at his table with a newspaper. He did not look up when Greer came in, and he did not acknowledge the man in any way throughout the entire visit, but he was aware, with that particular peripheral attention he had developed over years of situations where peripheral attention was the thing that kept you functional, of everything that was happening in the room. Greer was watching him. He was trying to work out who Marcus was and whether he was a variable that needed to be accounted for or simply a regular patron who could be disregarded. Marcus could feel the calculation from across the room. When Greer left, he left a generous tip, another signal. This one meant for Celia, and smiled pleasantly at the door and said the food was excellent and he'd be back. Celia came to Marcus's table and sat down across from him, and for a moment they just looked at each other. "He's not going to make this easy," Marcus said. "I know," she said, "but I'm not going to be easy either." He almost smiled at that. He almost always almost smiled at things Celia said, because she had a way of saying the exact thing that was true in exactly the words that were required and no more. And there was something in that. The precision of her honesty, the absence of performance in everything she did, that struck him, every time, as the most remarkable thing he had encountered in a very long time of encountering things. Over the following 2 weeks, Greer made 3 more visits to Ford's table and 2 approaches to Celia on the street. each one a little more direct than the last, and each one handled by Celia with a composure that Marcus found himself increasingly awed by. She was not frightened, or if she was frightened, she had placed the fear somewhere useful and was not letting it govern her surface. She was courteous and firm and gave away absolutely nothing, and each time Greer left without what he had come for. Marcus, meanwhile, had been doing other work. He had spent several evenings with Celia going through her books, which were, as she had said, the hardest part, and they had together identified not only a way to restructure her loan payments that would leave less exposure for Greer to exploit, but also two potential new sources of income. The mine's superintendent, a taciturn Welshman named Rhys Davies, was open to a contract arrangement for daily meals for his senior staff, and a neighboring town, small enough to have no kitchen establishment of its own, had a monthly gathering of families that might support a periodic supply of Celia's preserved goods by freight wagon. Marcus had also, quietly and without drama, written a letter to a lawyer in Carson City, a man he had once done a service for, describing the situation and asking for information about the specific legal instruments Greer was likely to use and how they might be countered. The reply came on the 15th of November, and it was useful. He brought the letter to Celia on a cool evening when the restaurant was closed, and she was sitting at her kitchen table doing the accounts by lamplight, and he sat across from her and they read it together, their heads inclined over the page, and Marcus was aware of the closeness, the particular warm, alive closeness of being near someone in a small, lamplit space in the cold of the evening in a way that he had not been aware of closeness in a very long time. The letter outlined a specific counterinstrument that Celia could use to formalize the ownership structure of the building in a way that would make Greer's usual approach significantly more difficult and expensive to pursue. It would cost some money and would require a brief trip to Carson City to file the paperwork properly. "I can't leave the restaurant for that long," Celia said, looking at the letter. "You could close for 3 days," Marcus said. "Post a notice. People will understand." She looked at him. "Will you come?" The question was asked practically, in the tone of someone determining the logistics of a necessary journey, but it landed in the room between them with a weight that both of them were aware of and neither immediately addressed. "Yes," Marcus said. She looked back at the letter and made a small note in the margin. "All right," she said. "We'll go next week." They went by stage to Carson City, which took a full day on the main road, and was an experience that Marcus found unexpectedly pleasant. The rocking motion of the coach, the succession of desert and mountain terrain outside the window, and Celia beside him with a book open in her lap that she was reading with genuine attention despite the jolting. He watched the landscape, and occasionally she would look up from her book and point out something she had noticed: a hawk circling on a thermal, a cluster of cottonwoods along a dry creek bed, the particular color of the rock strata in a cut through a hillside. And the things she noticed were always interesting things, things that an inattentive person would have missed. They stayed at separate lodgings in Carson City, which was the obvious and correct arrangement, and spent 2 days doing what they had come to do. The lawyer was a small, shrewd man named Theodore Marsh, who took their situation in hand with the efficient pleasure of someone who disliked men like Greer on principle, and found a good degree of personal satisfaction in arranging the legal landscape against them. The paperwork was filed. The protections were established. Celia paid Marsh's modest fee without hesitation and shook his hand with a directness that clearly pleased him. On the evening of the second day, Marcus and Celia ate supper together in a proper restaurant in Carson City, a more elaborate establishment than Ford's table, with tablecloths and a printed menu, and a wine list that Celia examined with frank curiosity. And over the meal something shifted between them in a way that had been building for weeks, and that neither of them had yet named. The shift was not dramatic. There was no single moment that could be pointed to as the turn. It was more like the gradual brightening of a room when the lamp is turned up slowly. The same room, the the same two people, but the light showing more of everything, making visible what had been present but dim. They talked for a long time over that supper, and then over coffee afterward, and then over nothing at all except the pleasure of the conversation itself, which had developed, over the past weeks, into the kind of conversation that is rare and irreplaceable, the kind where both people are fully present, and the words between them feel worth saying and worth hearing, and the silence between the words feels easy rather than pressured. Marcus told her about his father, a cattle rancher in central Texas, who had put those spurs on his boots with steady, proud hands, and told him that a man should always know where he was going and mean it when he got there. His father had died of a fever 5 years ago, and his mother had gone back east to her own family, and the ranch had been sold, and Marcus had found himself with the spurs and the boots and the philosophy, and not much else. Celia told him about her childhood in Missouri, about the small town where she had grown up that was the kind of place that expected her to want the things it offered, and could not quite adjust itself to the fact that she was always looking past the edges of it. She had married Daniel Ford at 22 because he was kind and curious and wanted to go west, which had seemed to her like the best possible combination of qualities in a man. She had loved him genuinely and grieved him genuinely and continued to love him in the way that the dead can be loved when you are honest about the fact that the living need to continue living. "Do you think about leaving Dustfall?" Marcus asked. Celia considered this. "I think about what I would leave behind," she said. "The restaurant, what I've built there. There's more of me in those walls than I expected there to be when I started. That's not the same as wanting to stay forever." She looked at him with those careful dark eyes. "No," she said, "it isn't." They went back to Dustfall on the third day, sitting in the same seats in the same stage, and the landscape went past in reverse: the strata, the cottonwoods, the hawk or a different hawk circling a different thermal, and Celia was reading her book again but less of it, and Marcus was watching the desert in the slant light of the late afternoon and feeling, with a certainty that was almost alarming in its clarity, that he was in significant trouble of the most worthwhile kind. When Greer came to the restaurant again in late November, Marcus was at his table. But this time, when Greer smiled his smooth, careful smile at Celia, and opened with his usual pleasantries and began to angle toward his real purpose, Celia simply reached under the counter and placed the relevant documentation on the table in front of him. The legal filings, the formalized ownership structure, the name and address of Theodore Marsh in Carson City, and told him, in the same plain, steady voice she used for everything, that the matter of the restaurant's financial arrangements had been resolved and there was nothing further to discuss. Greer looked at the papers. He looked at Marcus. He looked back at Celia. He was a calculating man, not a foolish one, and Marcus could see him doing the calculation, running the numbers, weighing the cost and the probable return against the newly complicated legal landscape, and the unknown variable of the man, with the Spurs sitting near the door, who had been here every morning and every evening for 6 weeks, and who had the particular, quiet stillness of someone who knew exactly how to make a great deal of trouble if he decided it was warranted. Greer picked up his hat, which he had placed on the counter with the careful politeness of a man who wanted to appear unthreatening. He put it back on. "A good establishment," he said to Celia, and the pleasantness in his voice had become something thinner, something that was still technically polite but that had given up on warmth as an unnecessary expense. "Mrs. Ford." He left. His men followed him out of Dustfall that same afternoon, and the stage that carried them north kicked up a dust trail that was visible from the main street for a long time before it disappeared into the gray distance. That evening, Celia closed the restaurant early and cooked supper for just the two of them. A real supper, not the end-of-service leftovers or the quick meals between rushes, but something she had thought about and prepared with intention. A beef roast that had been cooking all day, with root vegetables and a gravy that had depth and complexity, and the faint sweetness of good stock reduced to its essence. Fresh bread, the plum preserve, and a bottle of wine that she had been keeping for what she called, with a slight smile, an appropriate occasion. They ate by lamplight at the table nearest the counter, the one that had become, through the organic accumulation of 6 weeks of mornings and evenings, their table, and they drank the wine and talked, and outside Dustfall's night sounds came and went, voices from the saloon, a horse somewhere, the wind picking up around the buildings, and Marcus found himself, somewhere in the middle of the second glass of wine, in the middle of something Celia was saying about the book she was currently reading. That he had stopped listening to the words and was simply looking at her face, at the way the lamplight moved across it, at the particular warmth of her expression when she was talking about something that genuinely interested her, which was most things, and he understood with a sudden, final, irrefutable clarity that he was completely in love with this woman. It was not a comfortable realization. It was the opposite of comfortable. It was the kind of realization that requires a man to look at the full inventory of what he is carrying and decide what to do with it. And Marcus Quinn's inventory included 3 years of deliberate distance, and a set of spurs he had not taken off, and a settled conviction that he was not, in any fundamental sense, a man who deserved to stay. He looked down at his boots. The spurs caught the lamplight, small bright silver curves against the worn brown leather. Celia had noticed him looking. She was quiet for a moment. "Tell me about the spurs," she said, not accusingly, not insistently, just the way she asked everything directly, honestly, leaving room for the answer to be whatever it actually was. Marcus told her everything he had told her before, the full story of Redrock Crossing, but this time he told the part of it he had not told before, the part about his father, about what the spurs meant, about the decision he had made in the first hours of riding away, and the way that decision had calcified over 3 years from a choice into a sentence. Celia listened with her full attention and her hands around her wine glass and her dark eyes steady and serious. When he finished, she said, "Do you think your father would have understood that?" Marcus thought about his father, the hands putting the spurs on his boots, the voice saying a man should know where he was going and mean it when he got there. "I think he would have told me I'd confused punishment with purpose," he said. "Yes," Celia said simply. "That's what I think too." There was a silence that was full rather than empty, the kind that has weight and texture and means more than most words. "You are allowed to rest, Marcus," Celia said quietly. It was the first time she had used his first name, and they were both aware of it. It was not a slip. It was a choice, small and deliberate and significant in the way that small, deliberate choices always are. "You have been carrying this for 3 years. You are not as guilty as you decided you were, and even if you were, 3 years is a sufficient penance for most crimes that do not include murder." Marcus looked at her for a long moment. The lamplight was very warm. The wine was very good. The beef roast had been the best meal he had eaten in 3 years, and the company had been the best company he had had in longer than that, and the woman across the table was looking at him with the same direct, undeceived, genuinely compassionate gaze she brought to everything, and he felt the sentence, the 3-year sentence he had imposed on himself, cracking along its seams in the warmth of her attention. He looked down at his boots again, at the spurs. He bent down and unbuckled the left one. He set it on the table between them. He unbuckled the right one and set it beside the first. They sat there in the lamplight, 2 small silver things that had traveled 4 territories in 3 years and made their sound against 1,000 different floors. And without them, the room felt both quieter and somehow larger. Marcus sat up and looked at Celia, and she was looking at him with an expression that he did not yet have all the words for, something that was not pity and not triumph, and not even simply relief, but something more complex and more sustaining, something that looked like the beginning of something rather than the end. "Thank you," he said, and was not sure exactly what he was thanking her for, but knew it was the right word. "You're welcome," she said, and meant it. He reached across the table slowly, not impulsively. He was not an impulsive man, and covered her hand with his. Her hand was warm and capable, the hand of a woman who made bread and managed books and stood up to men like Greer and kept white curtains in a desert town, and it turned under his and held on. They did not say anything for a long moment, and the silence was the best silence Marcus Quinn had sat in 3 years. December came to Dustfall with a cold that came down hard from the mountains, the kind of cold that turned the morning sky a deep crystalline blue and made the ground ring like iron under a boot heel and coated the water troughs with an inch of ice by midnight. The town contracted inward, the way frontier towns did in winter-less movement, more fire, the saloon fuller in the evenings, the streets quieter in the mornings, the whole community folding in on itself in the particular companionable way of people who have committed to enduring a season together. Ford's table did good winter business. There was something about Celia's kitchen that became, in the cold months, a source of genuine communal warmth. Not just the physical warmth of the stove and the hot food, but something social and necessary. The warmth of a place where people were known and welcomed and fed with real attention. Marcus found himself integrated into this in a way that he had not experienced since his years in Red Rock Crossing, before everything had gone wrong, integrated in the daily sense of belonging to a place, of being recognized on the street, of having a chair at a table that was understood to be his. He helped Celia with heavy deliveries and small repairs. He negotiated the contract with Reese Davies at the mine, which went through cleanly and provided a steady additional income. He organized the first shipment of preserved goods to the neighboring town, riding with the freight wagon himself to ensure everything arrived intact and was well received, which it was. He was not a man who talked about what he was feeling, and Celia was not a woman who required that he do so. But there was between them, by December, an understanding that had been built up through hundreds of mornings and evenings and conversations and silences, and the understanding was simply this: that they were, both of them, people who had been alone for too long and had found in the other someone who made the world feel genuinely better, more inhabitable, more worthwhile, more interesting, and that this was not a small thing. It was, in fact, the largest thing. It was in early December, on a night when the wind had come down from the mountains with real violence and was making the building creak and the windows rattle, that Marcus kissed Celia Ford for the first time. They had been in the kitchen after the evening service, and she had been showing him something in one of her books, a passage about desert botany that she had found interesting, and they had been standing close together over the open page, and he had looked up from the page to say something and found her face very near his, and the thing he had intended to say went entirely out of his mind. He kissed her. She kissed him back with the same quality of attention she brought to everything full and real and unhurried, without performance or reserve. And the wind knocked at the windows and the stove ticked, and outside the desert winter did what it did, indifferent and magnificent. When they separated, Celia looked at him with those steady dark eyes, and there was a brightness in them that he had not seen quite this clearly before. Not the suppressed brightness of someone keeping their feelings out of their work, but the open brightness of someone who has decided to let a thing be fully what it is. "About time," she said. Marcus laughed, which surprised him, because he could not remember the last time something had struck him as genuinely funny rather than merely bearable, and the laugh was real and came from somewhere deep, and Celia was smiling. And for a long moment the kitchen of Ford's table in Dustfall, Nevada, in the winter of 1878, was the most significant place in Marcus Quinn's experience of the world. He told her that he loved her on a quiet afternoon in mid-December, standing in the doorway between the kitchen and the dining room, with the afternoon light flat and cold through the white curtains and the smell of bread baking in the kitchen. He said it simply, without preamble or drama, because that was the kind of man he was, and she looked at him for a moment with the full, serious attention she had given to everything he had ever said to her, and then said, with equal simplicity and equal seriousness, that she loved him too. There was, after that, a period of weeks that Marcus would look back on for the rest of his life, with a particular quality of gratitude the sustained, daily gratitude of someone who knows what it is to be without something fundamental, and who has, against all reasonable expectation, been given it back. The weeks were full of ordinary things. The mornings with coffee and newspapers, the evenings with good food and real conversation, the small joint tasks of a life being lived in a place. But the ordinary things were lit from within by the warmth between them. The way a window lit from inside is the most inviting thing in a cold night street. And Marcus, who had spent 3 years riding past such windows without stopping, had finally come in out of the dark. Christmas in Dustfall was a modest affair, a church service, a gathering at the town hall with food contributed by households and establishments around town, a handful of children who had been told all year to expect less than they would like, and who received somewhat more than that, and were accordingly delighted. Celia provided a substantial portion of the food for the gathering, and refused to let Marcus pay for any of the materials over his repeated arguments to the contrary. "You can contribute by carrying the boxes," she told him, which he did, and which was, somehow, the most contented morning he could remember spending. At the gathering, he met the Walcott family. Henry Walcott was a big, weathered man of about 50, with a face that had been worked on by the sun and the years, and still had an essential kindness in it that the working had not removed. Louise Walcott was a spare, sharp-eyed woman who looked like she had decided a long time ago to find life interesting rather than otherwise, and had maintained this decision across considerable provocation. Marcus introduced himself with his full name. He saw the moment of recognition cross Henry Walcott's face, the slight stilling, the recalibration, and he met it directly because there was no other honest way. "Marcus Quinn," Henry Walcott said. He was quiet for a moment. "From Redrock Crossing." "Yes," Marcus said. Another silence. Louise Walcott was looking at Marcus with the sharp eyes and said nothing, waiting on her husband. Henry Walcott extended his hand. "We're doing all right," he said. "In case you wondered." Marcus shook the hand. "I did wonder," he said. "I'm glad to know it." That was all. There was no scene, no confrontation, no dramatic resolution. Just a handshake between two men in a frontier town at Christmas, which was the kind of resolution that the real world offered most of the time, and which was, in its untheatrical smallness, more healing than any dramatic gesture could have been. He told Celia about it that evening, and she listened and then said, "Good," and meant it in the full, uncomplicated sense. On the evening of January the 3rd, 1879, with the new year settled cold and clean around Dustfall, Marcus Quinn asked Celia Ford to marry him. He asked her at their table at the end of the evening service, with the restaurant empty and the lamps turned low and the stove doing its steady work in the back wall. He did not have a ring because he had not known he was going to ask her until about 3 minutes before he did, which was characteristic of him in the best possible way, not impulsive, not thoughtless, but simply arriving at the exact moment when something that had been becoming true for a long time finally became fully true. He told her that he had not known he was capable of this, of staying in a place, of building something, of wanting a future rather than simply enduring a present. He told her that she had given him back the ability to believe in those things, which was the most valuable thing anyone had ever given him. He told her that he wanted to spend the rest of his life at her table, her actual table, the blue-green oilcloth table in the corner near the counter, and doing whatever was needed to be worth the place at it. Celia Ford looked at Marcus Quinn for a long moment with those steady, dark, entirely honest eyes, and then she said yes. The wedding was held in February, small but proper, the town minister presiding. A dozen neighbors and regulars, and Bert Calloway from the livery, and Reese Davies from the mine, and Henry and Louise Walcott from Miners Junction, who had driven in 2 days early in their wagon with a case of excellent preserved things as a gift. Celia wore a dress she had made herself in the week since January, a deep blue wool with cream at the collar and cuffs, and Marcus wore his best coat and his clean boots, without the spurs, which sat on a shelf in the living quarters above the restaurant, not discarded but retired, kept as a reminder of a different kind now. They said the words in front of their small assembly, and the minister pronounced them husband and wife, and Marcus kissed her with the same care and fullness he brought to everything he did in her presence, and the room made a noise of warm, collective approval. And the Nevada winter light through the windows of the town hall was the same crystalline blue it had been every morning since December, clean and cold and absolutely clear. That spring, Marcus formally became a partner in Ford's Table Ford and Quinn. The sign above the door was amended to read, which Celia said was unnecessary, and Marcus said was accurate, and so it stayed. He expanded the operation in two directions: a stable arrangement with a freighting company that allowed them to get better prices on supply orders from Carson City, and a small kitchen garden in the lot behind the building, which they broke ground on in March and planted in April with seeds that Celia had ordered from a catalog that came through on the stage. The garden was Marcus's particular project. He had not expected to care about it, but he found that there was something enormously satisfying about putting things into the ground and having them come up. The slow, patient, completely reliable cycle of it, the way it rewarded attention and consistency, and the willingness to be in one place long enough to see a thing through from beginning to end. He grew tomatoes and green beans and several varieties of squash and herbs, the same herbs that had been in the eggs the first morning he had eaten at Ford's table, which turned out to be a variety of chive that Celia had been growing in a pot on the kitchen windowsill, and which now had an entire dedicated row in the garden. He visited Henry Walcott's spread in Miners Junction in April, riding out with a purpose that was partly professional. He was interested in whether there was a potential supply arrangement for fresh beef, and partly something more personal. The visit was ordinary and good. Louise Walcott fed him lunch without ceremony, and Henry showed him the property with the pride of a man who had built something after losing something, and Marcus drove cattle back through the afternoon desert light, feeling lighter than he had in years. He told Celia about it over supper that evening. She listened with her hands around her coffee cup and a warmth in her expression that was entirely his, meant for him, given without reservation. "Did you tell him," she asked, "that you needed to know they were all right?" "Not in so many words," Marcus said, "but I think he understood." She nodded. "Some debts don't need to be said aloud to be settled," she said. By summer, Ford's Table had become something that Dustfall had come to depend on in the way that small communities come to depend on establishments that are genuinely good at what they do and genuinely committed to the place where they do it. The lunch service was full most days. The evening service required, during the mining company's busiest stretches, a second table arrangement. Celia had taken on a young woman from town, a 16-year-old named Abigail Hart, whose family had been in Dustfall since the early boom days, to help with service. Abigail was competent and quick, and had a cheerful toughness that Celia appreciated and that Marcus liked immediately. Celia taught Abigail to bake in the mornings, a slow and patient transfer of knowledge that Marcus sometimes observed from the kitchen doorway. Celia's hands guiding the younger ones through the particular pressure and rhythm of bread making, her voice explaining things in the same plain, precise way she explained everything. He watched this on a July morning and thought that she was remarkable. He thought this regularly and specifically, not in the vague way that people apply the word remarkable to things they admire generally, but in the detailed, particular way of someone who has spent months paying close attention to exactly what makes a person what they are. In August, Celia told him she was pregnant. She told him at the table, their table, the blue-green oilcloth table, the only table at which any significant thing in their life together seemed to happen on a morning when Abigail had been sent on an errand, and the restaurant was quiet, and the summer light through the white curtains made the whole room warm and golden, and Marcus was drinking his second coffee of the day, and not particularly thinking about anything. She told him simply and directly, the way she did everything, watching his face with the careful attention of someone who genuinely does not know what they are about to see there. He put his coffee cup down very carefully. He looked at her. The news was moving through him in a way that was too large and too warm and too complicated for anything resembling articulate speech, and for a moment he just looked at her face in the August morning light, at the steadiness of her eyes and the slight nervous tension in the set of her mouth that told him this mattered to her enormously, that she needed to know how he received it. "Celia," he said. "Yes," she said, still watching. "You wonderful woman," Marcus said, which was not what he had intended to say and was also exactly what he had intended to say. And then he was up from the table and she was standing too, and he was holding her the way he had learned she liked to be held. Firmly, without diffidence, the full honest warmth of it. And her forehead was against his jaw, and his hands were in her hair, and the August light was moving through the curtains, and outside Dustfall was conducting its ordinary summer morning business, without the slightest awareness that the man with the quiet spurs and the woman with the white curtains were standing in their small, good, particular restaurant at the center of a moment that was the fullest thing either of them had ever inhabited. The winter of 1879 was milder than the previous one, which the old-timers in Dustfall said meant a hard winter the year following, but which, in the present, made Celia's last months of pregnancy more comfortable than they might otherwise have been. She worked as long as she could past the point that Marcus thought she should, a difference of opinion they had with good humor and without resolution, because Celia Ford's relationship with her own capacity was not a thing that yielded to outside opinion. And then, in the final weeks, handed the kitchen to Abigail with careful instructions, and supervised from the chair near the stove. Their son was born on the 23rd of March, 1880, in the bedroom above the restaurant, delivered by the town doctor and attended by Louise Walcott, who had arrived 3 days earlier and shown no intention of being anywhere else. He was a large, healthy, loud-voiced boy who made his opinions about the world known from the first breath. They named him Thomas Daniel Quinn Thomas after Marcus's father, Daniel after Celia's husband, because Celia believed that the dead could be honored without being held onto, and because Daniel Ford had been a good man who had brought her to this place and this life, and it seemed right to carry his name forward into the next generation of it. Marcus held Thomas Daniel Quinn on the morning of the 24th of March in the bedroom above the restaurant, with the early spring light coming through the window and Celia sleeping with the deep exhaustion of labor and the warm particular peace of a woman who has done something enormous and is now resting in its aftermath, and looked at this small, furious, entirely real person and felt the full, staggering weight of what his life had become. 3 years of spurs and roads. 3 years of moving, because stopping was not permitted. 3 years of penance for a mistake that had turned out in the long view to be a hard thing that had made strong people stronger, not canceled by this, not erased by it, but set in its proper proportion at last. And then a woman in a desert restaurant had said, quietly and without ceremony, "Come sit down," and the whole long traveling had ended. He looked at his son. He looked at his wife asleep in the morning light. He looked out the window at the spring sky above Dustfall, Nevada, which was the particular clean blue of desert March, completely clear from edge to edge. He stayed. In the years that followed, Ford's table grew slowly and honestly in the way that good things grow, not with the violent upward surge of a silver boom, but with the steady accumulation of quality and consistency and genuine care. A second room was added in 1881, when the restaurant's reputation had reached the point where a single room was no longer adequate for the custom it received. The garden behind the building expanded to fill most of the lot, and in the summer it produced more than the kitchen needed, and the surplus went by stage to two neighboring towns whose residents, Marcus found, were willing to pay reasonable prices for good preserved goods that arrived in reliably excellent condition. Dustfall itself went through its own changes in these years. The mine played out further and the population reduced somewhat, but the town found a kind of sustainable equilibrium that the more frantic boom towns did not, partly because the people who stayed were the kind who had come for reasons that did not evaporate when the silver did. The Grand Hotel restored its sign. A schoolhouse was built at the east end of town. Abigail Hart grew into a formidable cook in her own right and eventually became the kitchen manager at Ford's table, which freed Celia for the work she increasingly enjoyed most: the preserving, the menu development, the training of the two additional young people they took on as the operation grew. Marcus managed the business side with the same focused, detailed attention he had once given to trail routes, always knowing where the terrain was difficult, always planning routes around the hard places rather than pretending they did not exist. He was good at it in a way that surprised him, though it should not have, because the skills were the same skills, only applied to different territory. He also, in the quiet hours between the lunch and evening service, when Thomas Daniel was old enough to come with him, taught his son to ride. Not the fast, show-off riding of young men with something to prove, but the real, working riding that a man needed in this country: how to read a horse's mood, how to manage terrain at different speeds, how to conserve a mount over a long distance. Thomas Daniel was a natural at it, not surprising, perhaps, from a man who had crossed 4 territories and a woman who had driven a team from Missouri to Nevada, and he took to it with the same serious, focused pleasure that his mother brought to bread making, and his father brought to everything he did once he had decided it was worth doing. In the spring of 1883, Thomas Daniel Quinn was 3 years old and already requiring 2 adults to contain his ambitions regarding the garden, the horses, and the tin of sugar that was kept on the high kitchen shelf for baking purposes. And in that same spring, on a morning when the desert was doing the extraordinary thing it did for about 2 weeks every April, blooming in the particular extravagant way of places that have been dry for months and then receive water, the whole floor of the valley around Dustfall briefly covered in low color, yellow and purple and white. A profligate, beautiful waste of effort that the desert made look completely inevitable. Celia told Marcus that they were going to need the second bedroom above the restaurant after all. She told him at the table, their table. The blue-green oilcloth was more worn now. They had replaced it once and intended to replace it again when the spring orders came in. And the coffee was the same coffee, from the same supplier, which had become over the years a kind of anchor, a sensory constant that meant morning and home and the beginning of another day worth being present for. Marcus looked at her across the table in the April light and felt the same thing he always felt when he looked at her, the particular, grateful, undiminishing certainty that she was extraordinary, not in the shining, distant way of things one admires, in the close, specific, fully known way of things one loves. "Another one," he said. "Another one," she confirmed, with the slight smile that was entirely hers, "the real one, the one that didn't care whether you noticed it or not." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. She turned her hand and held on the same way she had the first time on the evening they had shared wine and he had removed his spurs and the sentence of 3 years had finally, mercifully ended. "What do you want?" he asked. "Boy or girl?" "I want healthy," she said. "The rest is a detail." "A detail," Marcus repeated, and the love in his voice was not hidden or managed but simply there, fully present, because after everything, the 3 years of roads, the penance that had not been sufficient restitution for a mistake that had not been the catastrophe he had made it, he had finally learned that the only honest thing to do with a feeling this size was to let it be the size it was. Their daughter was born in November of 1883, in the same bedroom above the restaurant, again attended by the doctor and by Louise Walcott, who had by now made the trip from Miners Junction twice for this family, and seemed to regard it as among her better investments of time. She was a smaller, quieter, more internally focused person than her brother from the first hour of her existence, with her mother's dark eyes and her father's capacity for stillness. They named her Clara, which was Celia's mother's name, and her middle name was Louise, because Louise Walcott had made a long drive twice now and had earned the honor. In the December of that year, on the evening of the anniversary of the night Marcus had removed his Spurs, Celia brought them down from the shelf in the living quarters. The two small silver Spurs that had traveled 4 territories and marked 3 years of deliberate, necessary solitude and set them on the table between the candle and the coffee cups. They looked at them together in the candlelight. Thomas Daniel was asleep upstairs. Clara was 3 weeks old and asleep in the cradle that Marcus had built from good cedar over the past month, working on it in the evenings with a carefulness that was not the carefulness of a man trying to make something beautiful, though it was beautiful, but the carefulness of a man who understood that what he was making mattered. "Where do you think they should be?" Celia asked. Marcus picked one up and turned it in the light. The silver was still bright, still catching, still making its small glint. He set it down. "Here," he said, "on the shelf where we can see them." She looked at him. "Not put away, not put away," Marcus said. "They're part of how I got here. I don't want to pretend otherwise." She considered this with the same thoughtful honesty she brought to everything, and then nodded once. "All right," she said. He reached across and touched her face, the face that had been the first thing to genuinely stop him in 3 years of unstoppable movement, the face he had sat across this table and learned and loved and was still, every day, finding new things in. She turned toward his hand and closed her eyes for a moment, just a moment, with the complete and undefended ease of a person who is exactly where they want to be. Outside, the Nevada winter had settled hard and clear over Dustfall, the stars enormous overhead, the desert floor whitened with the season's first frost. The restaurant was quiet. The stove in the corner was doing its measured, steady work. The white curtains, new ones, Celia replaced them every year in the spring, were still against the cold, dark windows. And Marcus Quinn, who had not removed his Spurs for 3 years, until a woman had asked him quietly to sit down at her table, sat in the warm, lamplit center of the life he had built with her, with this particular, remarkable, entirely real woman who made plum preserve and kept white curtains, and had looked at him in a doorway with practical dark eyes, and said simply, "Come sit down," as if his sitting down were the most obvious and necessary thing in the world, and understood, in the full, unhurried, grateful way of a man who has been given back everything he had convinced himself he did not deserve, that he was exactly where he belonged. He had arrived. He was staying. This was the territory, and it was good.